It was just past midnight when the flashing lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Her car hummed softly as she coasted along the darkened road, weaving through the empty streets of the city. She had just finished a late-night rehearsal for an upcoming play and was heading home, the weight of the long hours of work pressing down on her shoulders. She glanced at the dashboard, her eyes momentarily catching the time as the seconds ticked by in a steady rhythm. She was exhausted, ready to collapse into bed, but the sudden blue and red lights reflected in her rearview mirror interrupted that plan. She sighed deeply before pulling over to the side of the road. The streetlights above cast long shadows across the pavement, the sound of her tires rolling to a stop echoing in the otherwise silent night, the car's engine purring softly. She glanced into the side mirror and saw the silhouette of a man approaching, tall in his uniform, his steps echoing in the night. As he reached her window without hesitation, she rolled it down. His face came into view, a middle-aged man, his eyes cold, his expression serious. A quick glance at his badge showed his title, judge. She felt a knot form in her stomach. For some reason, she hadn't expected him to be a judge. She had been expecting a regular police officer, but a judge. It was strange. It felt almost surreal. It didn't seem to make sense. He looked at her through the window, assessing her without a word for a moment. It was as if he was trying to decide if she was worth his time or not. She met his gaze unflinchingly. She had been through this kind of thing before and knew the drill, but something about his presence unsettled her. He leaned forward, slightly peering into the car, as if searching for something hidden beneath the surface. He noticed the stack of scripts beside her on the passenger seat, the thick pages almost spilling over the sides of the folder. She had been carrying them with her for weeks, and she knew they were worn from a constant handling. The judge's eyes lingered for a moment too long on the papers before he finally spoke. His voice was firm and clipped, the way someone who was used to giving orders spoke. "You were speeding," he said simply. She blinked in surprise. It wasn't as if she didn't know, but the way he said it made it feel almost accusatory, as if he had caught her in the act of something far worse. His tone left no room for negotiation or explanation. She opened her mouth to speak, but he didn't give her the chance. Instead, he motioned for her to hand over her driver's license and registration. She complied, her hands moving with practiced ease, despite the tension building in her chest. She handed him the papers, and he looked them over without any sense of urgency. She wondered for a brief moment if he had any idea who she was, or if it would even matter. She had been living in the city for years and had earned a reputation in the local theater scene, but that didn't mean much to someone like him, someone who probably never stepped foot in a theater. She thought it was a strange thing to assume, but she had learned long ago not to assume that the world of the arts meant anything to most people like him. She shifted in her seat, waiting silently for his next move, her mind wandering back to the rehearsal that had gone late and the mountain of tasks she had yet to complete for the show. There was so much to do, but none of it seemed to matter now. As she sat there in the stillness of the night, waiting for the judge to make his decision, she watched as he glanced at the papers in his hand, as if deciding something before looking back at her, his eyes now colder than before. He spoke again, this time his voice sharp. "You will have to pay a fine for speeding," he said, and then, without even offering an explanation, he handed her the ticket and turned to leave. No further words, no acknowledgement of the exhaustion in her eyes or the weight of her responsibilities. She stared at the ticket in her hand, feeling a sense of unfairness rising within her. But she said nothing, simply waited as he walked back to his vehicle, the hum of the engine and the flashing lights filling the silence once more. The woman sat in her car, staring at the ticket in her hands, her fingers gripping it tightly. As the night air seemed to grow colder around her, she took a deep breath, the frustration of the moment starting to settle in her mind, racing as she thought about the events of the day. The rehearsal had run longer than expected, but she had pushed herself through it. As always, she had to make sure everything was perfect, every detail of the play, every actor's line, every movement. She had worked tirelessly to make sure it would be a show worth remembering. But none of that mattered to the judge who had written her the ticket, as if she was just another person in the endless sea of ordinary citizens who didn't matter. She stared at the ticket again. The fine for speeding didn't even seem to make sense. The judge hadn't asked her anything about why she was out so late, or if she had an important reason for being on the road at such an hour. He had simply seen her car and decided she was guilty. Before even knowing her, he hadn't even bothered to look at the script she had in the passenger seat or ask about the work she was doing. Her mind flashed back to the rehearsals, where the actors had poured their hearts into every scene, where they had fought to make their roles come alive on stage. They were all working towards something bigger than themselves, something that meant something to them. But none of that would ever have mattered to someone like the judge who had just found her. He wouldn't understand her world the way she understood it. She let out a small sigh, shaking her head in disbelief. Before starting the car, the engine hummed to life, and she pulled back onto the road, slowly heading home. But as she drove, she couldn't help but think about how little people like him understood the world she lived in, and the way she worked in the theater, the hours that stretched late into the night, the sacrifices that came with being a director, the way she poured everything into her craft. It was a world that demanded every ounce of her energy, every drop of her creativity. And yet here she was being treated like a criminal by a judge who probably never even stepped foot in a theater. She wondered if he had ever seen a performance, or if he had ever understood the emotions that could be evoked by a single line of dialogue or a carefully staged scene. But she knew the answer without asking. He wouldn't know what it meant to create something that touched people's hearts in a way that could change their lives. He wouldn't know what it felt like to be in the midst of the magic of live theater, where everything was raw and real and vulnerable. She couldn't help but feel a sense of resentment toward him, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of determination. As she neared her apartment, she thought about the play again, the actors, the set, the music, the lighting, and how it all came together to create something that transcended the ordinary, something that was truly special. She would continue to pour her heart into it. She would keep working harder than ever, because that's what she did, no matter what, no matter how small the recognition or how little others understood the value of her work. She had her vision, she had her purpose, and that was all that mattered. As she turned into the parking lot, she could see her building in the distance, the familiar sight of home. After a long day of work, she parked the car and sat for a moment, staring out the windshield before finally stepping out, her shoes clicking against the pavement as she walked toward the entrance of her apartment. But even as she entered her apartment and started to take off her jacket, the ticket still lingered in her mind. It was a symbol of the unfairness she had experienced and the prejudice that came with it, a reminder of how easily people like the judge could dismiss someone like her without knowing anything about them, without even understanding what they stood for or what they contributed to the world. The next few days felt like a blur for her. The hours seemed to slip away as she dove headfirst into her work. The theater production was demanding every bit of her focus and energy. There was little room left for anything else. But even with all the rehearsals and meetings, the ticket that judge had handed her kept resurfacing in her thoughts. It gnawed at her constantly, like a weight hanging over her mind. Every time she walked into the rehearsal space, she couldn't help but remember how he had looked at her with that cold, detached expression, as if she were just another face on a checklist to him. She was used to people underestimating her, but something about the judge's treatment of her felt different. His assumption that she was just another person to be judged and punished without any understanding of who she was or what she did stuck with her more than she cared to admit. It wasn't just about the fine or the ticket or the mistake he had made in assuming she was like everyone else. It was about the larger issue, the larger way in which people like him looked at people like her without seeing the value of their work or their lives or their contributions. She had spent years building her career in the theater, and it had been anything but easy. She had faced countless obstacles and challenges along the way, but each time she had pushed forward because she knew what she was doing mattered. She knew that what she created with the actors on stage could touch people in a way few other things could, but none of that seemed to matter to the judge. It seemed like all that mattered was that she had been speeding at night and that she didn't fit into his narrow view of the world. But she couldn't let herself get bogged down by that. She had work to do, and people to lead. The play wasn't going to direct itself. She had a team of passionate actors who trusted her vision, and they had come so far in the rehearsal process. She couldn't afford to let the actions of one man ruin everything she had worked for, so she pushed the thoughts of the ticket aside and focused on her work. The stage lights were bright, and blinding as they cast long shadows across the theater. The actors moved around the stage with grace and precision, each movement timed to perfection. As they rehearsed the next scene, she stood in the back of the theater watching them. As they worked, listening to the way their voices filled the space with emotion, she smiled to herself as she watched their progress. They were growing into their roles, becoming more than just characters on a page. They were becoming real people. Their voices were filled with power, their bodies moved with purpose, and the energy in the room was palpable. The scene was coming together in ways she hadn't expected. The actors had surprised her with their depth and commitment to their craft. They had brought something new to the table, something she hadn't anticipated, and it filled her with a sense of pride. But despite all the success, she couldn't shake the feeling of being judged unfairly. She still remembered the judge's face, how he had never even bothered to understand her before handing down the fine. She still remembered how he had dismissed her without ever asking what she did for a living, or what kind of person she was. There was a moment of quiet in the rehearsal as the actors took a break, and she found herself lost in thought again, the weight of the ticket still hanging over her. But just as quickly she shook it off. She had a job to do. She couldn't let her thoughts distract her from the magic she was creating on stage. She called out to the actors, asking them to reset the scene, and as they moved into position, she felt a wave of determination wash over her. This play was her creation, and no one would take that from her, not the judge, not anyone else. She was a theater director, and that meant something more than any ticket or fine ever could. A few days later, the woman found herself sitting in the front row of a theater she had never been to before. She had been invited to attend a special performance of a well-known play the same night she had received the ticket from the judge. She had almost forgotten about the strange encounter with him. But here she was sitting in a plush seat waiting for the curtain to rise. She had to admit she was curious. She had heard of this theater before. It was known for its lavish productions and its high-profile patrons, the sort of place where people like the judge would probably feel at home with their polished suits and unspoken airs of superiority. She wasn't sure why she had agreed to attend the show, but something in her couldn't resist the idea of sitting in the audience for a change and seeing the world from a different perspective. As the lights dimmed and the audience hushed, she glanced around the room, taking in the grandeur of the space. The thick velvet curtains, the golden chandeliers that hung from the ceiling like something out of a dream. The air was thick with anticipation as the first notes of music filled the space. And then the actors appeared on stage. Her eyes followed their movements, captivated by the scene unfolding before her. But then it happened. She froze. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw a familiar face standing center stage in the spotlight, the same face she had seen just days earlier in the parking lot of the courthouse. The judge's face was transformed now, not the stern figure from their encounter, but an actor performing with grace and conviction. He was part of the cast. She couldn't believe her eyes at first. She thought it was some sort of mistake. But as the performance continued, she couldn't deny it any longer. The judge was an actor performing on stage, a member of the ensemble cast in a play she had never heard of. But there he was. She watched him move across the stage, his voice carrying the weight of each line as he delivered his performance with skill and emotion. He was good, better than she had expected him to be. But it wasn't just his acting that left her in awe. It was the way he moved, the way he commanded the stage, as if he had always belonged there, as if he had spent years learning the craft, honing his skills with a passion she hadn't known he possessed. She watched him in silence for a few moments, still in disbelief at the turn of events. She couldn't quite grasp the idea that the man who had fined her just days ago for a simple traffic violation was now here performing on stage. It was almost too much to process. But as the play continued, her attention remained fixed on him. She saw the care with which he interacted with the other actors, the way he listened to them with complete attention and responded with precision. He wasn't just playing a role, he was living it. He was becoming the character he was portraying. And in that moment she realized something she had never expected to understand. She realized that he wasn't so different from her in that regard. He too had chosen to dedicate himself to his craft in a way that demanded everything from him. He had given up pieces of himself to pursue his passion, just as she had given pieces of herself to create the world she lived in on stage. But despite this realization, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease deep within her. How many others had he treated like she had been treated? How many others had been dismissed or underestimated by someone like him? Someone who appeared to have everything figured out, someone who never took the time to understand the lives of those who didn't fit his narrow view of the world. She found herself thinking about the moments of their encounter, the way he had looked at her, the way he had assumed she was just another driver speeding through the night, without any regard for the world around her. She wondered if he had ever really seen her, or if he had simply seen a label to attach to her without asking who she truly was. As the play came to a close, the applause erupted from the audience, a standing ovation that filled the theater with a wave of energy and appreciation. The judge stood at the edge of the stage, his face now glowing with pride, his posture straight and strong as he took his bow, accepting the praise with a gracious smile. It was as if he had become a different person, someone more humble and open than the man she had met just days before. The contrast was almost staggering. She couldn't help but wonder how he had arrived at this moment, how he had found his way into the world of theater. How many years had he spent rehearsing, perfecting his craft, just as she had done for so long. As the crowd slowly filed out of the theater, she remained seated in her place, her thoughts swirling with confusion and curiosity. She wasn't sure what she felt anymore. The frustration from their previous encounter seemed distant, now replaced by a strange sense of understanding mixed with a touch of resentment. But she couldn't put her finger on why she felt this way. She had been so sure of her initial judgment of him, so certain that he was just another person who had no regard for the world of the arts, or for people like her. But here he was commanding the stage with such skill and confidence that it left her speechless. Maybe there was more to him than she had assumed, but did that mean she should forgive the way he had treated her that night? Or could she simply overlook the assumptions he had made about her because of the uniform he wore and the role he played in society? She wasn't sure if she could. She had spent too many years working hard to be seen for what she truly was, not for what others expected her to be, and that was something that weighed heavily on her heart. But as the audience slowly trickled out of the theater, and she remained seated, she found herself torn between the desire to hold on to her resentment and the recognition that perhaps he was more than just the judge she had met outside the courthouse. He had managed to do something she hadn't expected. He had opened a door to a part of himself she hadn't known existed, and in doing so had forced her to confront her own biases, her own assumptions about him and about others who might walk into her life. One day it was easy to judge people based on first impressions, to place them into neat little boxes where everything about them could be understood with a glance. But here she was realizing that the world wasn't that simple. There were layers to people she had never considered before, and just as she had made the choice to be a theater director and pour her soul into creating art, he had made a choice to step into this world and pour his own soul into the work he did on stage. Maybe that was where the connection lay, not in the roles they played in society, but in the passion that drove them both to seek meaning in a world that often overlooked their efforts. She stood up from her seat slowly, her legs stiff from sitting so long. She looked toward the stage again, where the judge was still interacting with the other actors, congratulating them on their performances, laughing and chatting, as if the world of theater was the only world that mattered. She shook her head slightly, as if trying to shake the strange feeling that had come over her. She didn't know what she was supposed to do with this new understanding of him. But one thing was certain: she couldn't just let it go. She had learned something about herself in that theater that night, something that would stay with her for a long time. She had learned that people weren't always what they seemed, and sometimes it took more than a ticket or a fine to understand who they truly were. She wasn't sure what the future held for her or for the judge, but she knew this encounter had changed something inside her, something that would make her more aware of the layers beneath the surface of every person she encountered in her life moving forward. The days following the performance felt strange for her, as if something inside her had shifted, but she couldn't quite name what it was. The rehearsals continued as usual with the same intensity and drive, but in the back of her mind, the judge's performance still lingered. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the realization that people were more complicated than the roles they played in society, and that assumptions could be dangerous. She had never been one to make snap judgments. She prided herself on seeing the complexity of people, but this encounter with the judge had forced her to confront a deeper part of herself, the way she had instantly labeled him the moment she saw him in uniform, the way she had dismissed him as just another authority figure who didn't understand the arts. She thought she was better than that. But in that instant she had fallen into the same trap she had always warned others against. She had assumed too much about him without knowing the full story, and now here she was watching the actors she directed day in and day out pouring their hearts into every performance. She realized they too were more than just the characters they portrayed. They carried their own histories, their own complexities, and it was easy to forget that in the midst of creating something beautiful on stage, she had always asked her actors to dig deep into their own emotions, to bring their full selves to the table, but she had never thought to extend that same level of understanding to the people she encountered outside the theater. It was a humbling realization, but one that she knew would change the way she interacted with the world around her. She found herself thinking more about the judge than she ever thought she would. Why had he chosen to pursue theater? Why had he hidden that part of himself from the world? Was it because of fear or shame, or had he simply never found the courage to fully embrace it? She wasn't sure if she would ever have the answers, but the curiosity gnawed at her. She wasn't about to go out of her way to confront him, but something told her this wouldn't be the last time their paths crossed. Life had a funny way of bringing people back together when they least expected it, and when it did, she would be ready to approach him not with judgment or resentment, but with an understanding that there was more to him than met the eye. The week went by quickly, with rehearsals becoming more intense. As opening night approached, the actors were at the top of their game, pushing themselves beyond their limits to make sure every moment on stage was perfect. She couldn't help but feel proud of them, proud of how far they had come and how much they had grown in the process. But as the days passed, she also felt an underlying tension. She knew that somewhere out there the judge was still part of her world in a way she hadn't expected, and she wasn't sure how to navigate that in the future. Should she confront him about the ticket? Should she let it go entirely? Or was there something deeper at play that she wasn't seeing? The idea of having to face him again made her uneasy, but she couldn't deny that she had learned something valuable from their encounter. She had learned that people weren't always what they seemed, and that there was often more beneath the surface than anyone realized. But even with this new understanding, she still struggled with the feelings that had surfaced after their meeting: the anger, the frustration, the unfairness of it all. She had wanted to move past it, but every time she thought about the ticket, it resurfaced: the memory of how he had so easily handed it to her, as if she were just another person to be punished. It was hard to let go of that image of him, but she knew deep down that holding on to it would only hurt her in the end. She had to find a way to reconcile what she had learned with how she had felt about the situation, and that would take time. But in the meantime, she would continue to focus on the play. The opening night was fast approaching, and there was no room for distractions. She needed to give everything she had to the production, because that's what mattered the most right now. This was her world, her passion, her art, and no one could take that away from her, no matter what had happened in the past. The night of the opening performance finally arrived, and the energy in the theater was electric. The air buzzed with anticipation as the audience filled the seats. She stood backstage watching as the actors prepared for their big moment, every one of them in their costumes ready to step into the spotlight and give everything they had worked so hard for. She could see the tension in their faces, the nervous excitement, the determination to make this night unforgettable. It was always like this before a big show: the rush of adrenaline mixed with the pressure to succeed. But she knew they were ready. They had rehearsed for months, and tonight was their night. It was her night too, her vision, her creation coming to life in front of an audience who didn't know what to expect but would soon be swept away by the magic of live theater. She had spent years perfecting her craft, too, just as the judge had spent years perfecting his own. She couldn't help but think of him again as she stood there watching her actors moving with such purpose in the wings of the stage. Where would he be tonight? Would he be in the audience watching with the same eyes that had once judged her so harshly? Or would he be somewhere else? She didn't know, but she couldn't shake the feeling that their worlds were about to collide again. She tried to push the thought away. She couldn't afford to get distracted now. This night was too important. She was ready to lead her actors into the performance they had worked so hard for. She stepped forward and made her way to the center of the stage, her eyes scanning the room as she took a deep breath and gave a small smile to the actors around her. This was the moment everything came together, the final piece of the puzzle she had built, and she could feel the weight of it all. But it wasn't a burden, it was a privilege, a chance to create something that would live in people's minds long after the curtains fell. She glanced at the clock and knew it was time. The show was about to begin. She walked to the front of the stage, giving a quick nod to the lighting technician, and then signaling the sound team to begin the opening music. The lights dimmed, and the audience fell silent. The magic was about to unfold. She stood back and watched as the first scene began to play out. The actors took the stage as if they had been born for this moment, their lines flowing with precision, their movements coordinated and fluid. She saw the passion in their eyes, the same passion that had driven her to become a director in the first place, the desire to create something meaningful, to share a piece of herself with the world. And as the play continued to unfold, she could see the audience becoming absorbed in the world she had built. They were laughing, crying, holding their breath as the drama played out before them. And for a moment she allowed herself to let go of everything, the ticket, the judge, the doubts, the frustrations, and simply enjoyed the performance. Her actors had brought it to life in ways she hadn't even expected. There were moments of pure magic when the audience was so deeply connected to the characters on stage that she could feel the electricity in the air. She could feel their emotions mirrored by the people in the seats. It was a reminder of why she did this, why she poured her soul into creating these performances, and why she had fought so hard to carve out a place for herself in this world of theater. It wasn't easy, and it never would be, but in this moment she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The night passed in a blur of applause and cheers, and when the final curtain fell, she stood backstage holding her breath. The actors came running off stage, breathless from the energy of the final scene. They were ecstatic with the performance they had given, and as they all gathered together, she felt a wave of pride wash over her. They had done it, they had delivered on every level, and now they would all share in the success together. The standing ovation from the audience was proof that their hard work had paid off. As the applause continued, she stood in the background for a moment, letting the joy and satisfaction of the night settle in, but somewhere deep down in the back of her mind, she still couldn't shake the feeling that the judge was out there somewhere watching them, watching her. And it made her wonder how he would perceive the woman he had once found, how he would see her now that she had proven herself in ways that mattered more than any ticket could ever measure. The days following the opening performance were filled with celebrations and congratulations, but she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was still left unresolved. As much as she had tried to push it aside, the memory of the judge lingered in the back of her mind, like a shadow that refused to dissipate. She had done everything she set out to do. She had poured her heart into the play, and it had been a success. The actors were proud of their work, and the audience had responded with overwhelming support. But there was still that one encounter that had shaped the course of this journey. She thought about the judge's face on that day, the way he had handed her the ticket so casually, as if her presence meant nothing to him. It wasn't just about the fine, it was the way he had dismissed her. It was the way he had assumed she was nothing more than a driver breaking the law without any regard for the world around her. What bothered her more than anything was that she had let him define her for a moment, that she had allowed his judgment to influence her view of herself, when she knew deep down she was more than that. But now, with the success of the play behind her, she realized something she hadn't fully understood before. The judge's actions hadn't defined her at all. They hadn't taken away her worth or her ability to create something meaningful. What they had done was push her to prove herself, and in doing so she had found strength she hadn't known she possessed. She had faced adversity and come out stronger on the other side. But she also realized something else. Sometimes people came into her life for a reason. Sometimes the encounters that seemed the most hurtful were the ones that taught the greatest lessons. And she had learned from him in ways she couldn't deny. She had learned that everyone had a story, and that no one could be defined by one moment or one action. It was easy to judge people based on the roles they played in the world, But what about the roles they chose for themselves, the roles they worked hard to master? The judge had chosen to be an actor, to embrace the craft and the art he had worked hard to get where he was, just as she had worked hard to get where she was. And perhaps that was the connection she had been searching for all along. It wasn't about forgiveness or revenge. It wasn't about proving anything to him. It was about understanding that everyone had their own struggles, their own battles. They fought in silence. And sometimes it took more than one encounter to truly see someone for who they were. She hadn't known what to expect when she walked into that theater all those days ago. But now she understood that it was never about the judge at all. It was about her own journey, her own growth, and the way she had chosen to overcome obstacles and create beauty in a world that often overlooked the value of the arts. She didn't need to confront him. She didn't need to demand an apology. She didn't need him to acknowledge the wrong he had done to her, because in the end it was her own self-worth that mattered most. She had found her voice. She had found her place in the world of theater, and nothing could take that away from her. Not a fine, not a judgment, not anything. She was more than the assumptions people made about her. She was more than any ticket. She was the director of her own story. And as the final curtain fell on the last performance of the play, she realized that it wasn't just the actors who had brought their story to life. It was her too. It had always been her. And that was enough.